We're very excited about this panel topic as well. We heard a lot this morning around funding and women and the proportion of funding that they're getting, in particular women from underrepresented communities. This also goes back to the research. So once again, we're going to sort of take what we learned from the research and try to apply it to what's happening on the ground. And this goes back to, this has been a consistent element of the research, and I can tell you this going way back to when women used to have a man signing for them for their loan, or their husband. I come from an entrepreneurial family, so I can actually attest to this. This actually happened. So we've come a long way in some areas, or the question is, have we? So I want to introduce our next panel. This discussion will have a look at what are the challenges and issues, what are the gaps, and what options, what's being done on the ground. So very pleased to welcome the next panel, Danielle Graham, the principal of DreamMaker Ventures and co-founder of Fierce Founders at the Communitech Women's Accelerator. We also have Noella Chakoli, founder of Scale Without Borders, and Chioma Ifani Okoro, who's the founder of My African Corner, and she's also a renowned speaker and lead consultant. And I'm being very brief because their bios are incredibly impressive. So I want to give them a chance to talk about what they are doing. Brooke Gordon, Senior Advisor, Women's Entrepreneurs at BDC in Ontario, who's leading new programming, and Shannon McDonald, Shannon is the Managing Director at Accenture. So I'm looking forward to this panel. I'm going to kick off the first question by asking each of you to tell us a little bit about what you're doing in your organization, and you can fold in a bit, we have to be mindful of the time, fold in a little bit about your journey in terms of what led you to do what you're doing now. So Danielle, do you want to?
Hello. Okay, perfect. So I'm a principal, not of a high school, so just wanted to clear that up. At DreamMaker Ventures, it is a venture capital fund with a broad-based diversity mandate focused on women, people of color, Indigenous communities, immigrants, refugees, LGBTQ+, and accessibility startups. So we actually launched last week an article on BetaKit with our 7 program partners, one of which was the program I founded 5 years ago called Fierce Founders, and one of the others is New Hela's Scale Without Borders. So I'd be happy to talk about each of those programs in more detail, how they were launched, what work we're doing together, and how that's going to drive greater diversity on an intersectional basis within the tech ecosystem. I started my journey with founding my own company through the Laurier Launchpad program. So I focused on water purification. So I had the experience of becoming what I thought was an entrepreneur and then categorized as woman entrepreneur. So that was, a surprising experience for me, given I hadn't seen ratios and numbers that made me the only in many rooms or the only in a lot of circumstances relating to funding. And each stage of my journey, people were noticing the fact that I was the only female. And so when I went through that, I decided to start Fierce Founders. And ever since then, I've been following along that journey on every level to see what are the resources that women entrepreneurs need. And that's what's led me to capital, because about 2 years ago, I started investing early stage and seed to bridge some of those gaps. And now we're at a venture capital fund that's continuing to bridge some of those gaps. And so I'll leave it at that for now, and I look forward to telling you more.
That was fantastic. You're very impressive, Danielle. So my name is Nuhela, and I'm a founder of Skill Without Borders, which is an organization to help newcomer tech entrepreneurs access the resources they need to succeed. I founded this company because I myself, I'm an immigrant. I immigrated from Morocco when I was 17 as an international student, and I also work full-time at the DMZ, which is a Ryerson-based university incubator. The DMZ, we've done some incredible work with underrepresented entrepreneurs, and I noticed that there was a gap in the broader ecosystem for immigrant tech entrepreneurs, so I went ahead and I started an organization separately for immigrant tech entrepreneurs. So yeah, that's pretty much myself, and happy to chat more later on.
Hi everyone, my name is Chioma Ifeanyiokoro, and I do two different things. I run a company called My African Corner, and what we do is we help Black entrepreneurs and professionals to grow in their careers and businesses. So we plan workshops, conferences, things like that in partnership with companies like Facebook, CIBC. More recently, I had this amazing ladies actually speak at one of my conferences called Build Fest, so yay to sisterhood. And then I'm also a speaker, so I'm very excited to be in this room because I see Manal in the room as well, and I'm one of the facilitators here at the Women Entrepreneurship Hub, which is just an incredible space for women entrepreneurs, and so I speak on personal branding and business growth. I'm happy to talk to you about, because I know we had some questions earlier on about networking, how to build strategic partnerships, how to ask for the business. I've done that. Happy to talk some more about that, but also positioning, which really speaks to how do you position yourself as a thought leader in your industry and get people to actually come to you. Leverage, so leveraging your experience, and LinkedIn.
Hi, my name is Brooke Gordon. I'm with the BDC, the Business Development Bank of Canada. So my role is actually a newly created role at the bank as Senior Advisor for the Women Entrepreneur Strategy in Ontario. And I'm part of a national team that's made up of a combination of executive sponsors and the senior management team at BDC, as well as a team of champions. So these are people within BDC who are passionate about working with women entrepreneurs. And so as the only bank dedicated to entrepreneurs, BDC really does believe that there's an opportunity there for us to work more closely with women entrepreneurs, recognizing part of our journey was really recognizing that there is an opportunity to have greater that there are barriers and that we definitely need to be able to step up to that. So some of the things that we have been doing, we doubled our lending target, so 1.4 billion by 2021. We have actually exceeded that. We're more than halfway there, so we have over 570 million funding to women-owned, majority women-owned businesses. We also provided over 2 million, or will be providing over 2 million in capital. So BDC obviously has the finance side, we've got capital, and we have advising as well. And so on the capital is for women-led technology companies. And to date, we've funded more than 25 of those amazing tech-led companies that are, again, majority owned by women. And then in addition to that, we have a number of partnerships within the ecosystem here. We talked about the network of networks, and BDC is very proud to be able to partner with many of those networks. And also one of the things that we do is a lot of work with what we call advisory, and so being able to have, whether it's mentorship or advice from companies who are looking to scale up and grow their business. So those are some of the key things that we're doing. At the moment, lots more that we have that I want to talk about, but I heard beforehand someone mentioned that there needs to be more access to free resources. And so in celebration of Women Entrepreneurship Day, which was yesterday, we relaunched our page for women entrepreneurs on the BDC website. And so if there's one takeaway I can take from today, please go there. It's bdc.ca, and if you look for I'm a Woman Entrepreneur, there's a ton of free resources that are available for entrepreneurs there. So certainly encourage you to check that out.
Hello, my name is Shannon, and as mentioned, Managing Director at Accenture. I had spent 27 years at Deloitte, so I've been a consultant or advisor in the business world my whole career. And I guess, to get to Mary's point about how, what's the journey and how did you get to support women entrepreneurs, I spent 3 years at Deloitte as the Chief Inclusion Officer, and that was a really enlightening experience. And I used a lot of data and programs and coaching, mostly focused at leadership in Deloitte to really try and develop and nurture inclusive leaders. And actually, that's pretty tough to do. So because people, are sometimes hardwired and they've been at their job for a long time, and so changing the way they lead and make teams is really difficult. But I certainly learned so much through that 3 years of trying to inject that thinking, which actually led me to want to shift my career. So I moved over to Accenture, which is a technology consulting company. And I really wanted to run something because I got a bit frustrated from trying to coach others to run diverse business units. And I thought, well, maybe I would have more pleasure in running one myself. And so now what I've tried to do from that learning is to be in positions where I can make decisions that actually create diversity. And it is kind of fun. It's neat. So I've been able at Accenture to build a team from the ground up, and really watching kind of as each person comes in, that not only do I have a balance and obvious visible diversity symbols, but that I'm really bringing in people who each think differently from the other. So that's been great. I was thinking of a story when you were talking about bringing babies to events, because Accenture's been doing a lot on diversity, and the person I report to happens to be the Chief Diversity Inclusion Officer for Accenture. And it was funny because she was doing succession, and she said, "Shannon, should I consider you?" And I'm like, "No, you do it once, it's good. I'm happy being able to run something." But nonetheless, Claudia is fantastic, and she always makes the team, which is mostly men, the senior leadership team, we meet weekly, have a diversity moment. So we start every meeting, who has the diversity moment to bring? Anyways, over the weekend, this group sent a photo, and Pierre sends the photo out, and he goes, "Hey everyone, check out this photo from our workshop this week. Do you see the diversity moment?" And before I got a chance to answer, 2 men answered, and one spotted the real diversity moment, which was in the room, probably 70% were men, 30% were women, but one of the men had a bottle and was nursing his, or not actually nursing, feeding his baby. And so that everyone was kind of like, cool, that's starting to see the balance that we want to see. So that was kind of fun. So I thought of that one. Not only are we encouraging women, the dads can come on in and feed the baby too. So the other things I just wanted to add sort of on my side of my desk, Creative Destruction Labs is it's basically a Canadian-wide university-based coaching program. So they bring in business leaders to coach people going through an entrepreneurship program, and sometimes invest in them as well. So I'm a coach at Dalhousie for the Creative Destruction Labs there, and the mentor group is again primarily men, and I find it fascinating again to be in a place where I can voice and interject a different kind of perspective as to whether this entrepreneur has a future potential business. And I do find I have a contrarian voice just because I'm from a different background, and it's not always women necessarily, but there are certain types of businesses that the men don't see the future potential in, and I've been able to kind of coach them through CDL through that year and make sure at the end that they are kind of recognized for actually being a successful business. It's often language, that's the difference. The men hear the business idea and they go, nah, that's not a business, but it's language, right? So anyways, that's been interesting. And then from that, the few women that are in the room are really trying to rally and make the women's voice stronger. So in Atlantic Canada, even though I do live in Toronto, we've created an Atlantic Women's Venture Fund. 9 of us have gotten together. 6 of the women live in Atlantic, 3 live in Toronto. But it's meant to be biased towards women entrepreneurs in Atlantic Canada, and it's meant again to kind of look at are we being equitable there. So as we talk about gaps and things, I can talk a little bit more about that. But those are the extracurriculars I guess I do to help bring the gap closing, which sadly I have spent my entire career watching the very slow movement of gaps closing in so many different sectors. So that's my thing.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Going to sort of get right to it, so to speak, with the first question that I'm going to give you, which is, what are the barriers to financing for women entrepreneurs? Now, that seems like such a simple question, and given the large body of work that's been done, we talked a little bit this morning about inequities in funding. Eleanor mentioned an article. I know that article. It's in the Journal of Business Venturing, where women who pitched social enterprise related ideas were more likely to get funding based on this research, which opened up huge questions for those of us that have been looking at this issue and raised even more questions. But I'm going to just keep the question as that simple. So I'd like you to speak from your own perspective, because each of you have had the perspective on this. So what are the barriers to financing facing women entrepreneurs? And in particular, the drill down is for racialized women or underrepresented communities. Yeah, Danielle?
Hey. Great, I'll start. Sorry, I'll start with my own experience as an entrepreneur, because I had a team, they were all men, and we went through the entire process of launching this company through Communitech. And what I experienced in that process was a lack of a different stage of network. So I would see, other guys, because my entire cohort within that program were men. I would see them going out for beers. I would see them suddenly, one guy had an extra $5K funding that I'd never heard about. And so, I didn't want to engage them in a social way. I wanted to work in a business. And so I found that network, that personal connection mattered so much to get ahead. And so, figuring out who are those people who you actually can connect with, especially when it's such a dominated environment by so many people who don't necessarily represent us. And so where I've started to work from an ecosystem side is to say, how do we get more representation on the funding side? Because right now we're looking at about 2% of venture-backed companies have a female founder, but the same number on the venture capital side of GPs. I'm not saying necessarily women will only invest in other women or women are the only people investing in women, but when you see those numbers correlated, you know that there's something there that needs to change on both ends. And so even with my founding team, my two partners for the venture capital fund are the only Black partners within the Canadian Venture Capital Association. And so there's so many ways that all of this needs to change. And a lot of it has to happen at a community level, and it needs to be community driven as well. And so if you're looking at maybe only from a gender-based level, you're not tapping into the challenges that so many of these other community people are dealing with. And so another example I'll give on a personal level is the work we did in the refugee community with a program called Jumpstart, where we piloted a program specifically for Syrian refugees. And what we saw was a clear segregation between the genders, where the Syrian women were sitting in the back and all of the men were sitting in the front asking all of the questions. And so now we've launched a women-only focused program specifically for that community in the next 2 years, and it's fully funded by FedDev. So that's one way where we're piloting, we're looking at the problems, we're taking an intersectional approach, we're working with community-driven organizations, such as Nuhela, so I'm gonna let her get to all of the amazing work that she's doing. But for me, I'm driven now to support women at a funding level because I've seen the challenges as an entrepreneur.
I can definitely add to that. I think that there are a host of reasons, but specifically VCs, women are underrepresented in VCs in general, right? Venture capital. So there's underrepresentation in venture capital, right? Well, that same effect is amplified because there are even less women of color in venture capital, right? And we do need to have that representation to help address the problem on the funding side for entrepreneurs, women entrepreneurs, and then racialized women entrepreneurs. So that's what I would add to that.
So I got very passionate about this topic, and I wrote a lot of notes, so get ready for this. Okay, so a lot of my work with My African Corner, the fights I have on a daily basis with that are education, access, so a seat at the table, essentially, right? And then funding comes after that, because the truth of the matter is, if you're not even in the room, you don't get to meet some of these people, right? So not just are women of color dealing with barriers like not being in the room. When we do get into the room, I'm going to share a story with you. What do we face, right? So I wanted to echo a lot of what Elise shared here, because it really resonated with me. This is like, I'm literally going through this myself and seeing other women in my network going through this as well on a daily basis. So access to programs, right? There's a lot of top programs. What are these programs? When we say woman entrepreneur, what does that mean, right? Like, is it tech entrepreneur, right? Is it small business owner? Like, and what programs exist for small business owners, right? So what access do we have? We always think that technology is one way and things must go one way, because that's the way that is, I'm going to use the word dominant culture, or whoever is in charge thinks that this is how things are supposed to go. But people invent based on their lived experiences, right? So if I'm going to invent something, I'm going to look around me and say, who else has this problem in my network, right? And I'm going to invent a solution for the people in my network. That's the same thing with women of color, right? So our businesses are not necessarily tech-based businesses, but they're solution-providing businesses, right? Which could use technology, which is the goal of technology at the end of the day, is using technology to solve problems for people. So I wanted to cover a few things. The two key things, like I mentioned before, access to programs and networks, and access to funding. So access to funding, there was a report, it's actually a US-based report, because as Elise mentioned as well, there's, like, we don't have stats in Canada, right? So this US-based report found that, it's called Project Diane, so you can look it up, found that for every 1 million that somebody raises in seed funding, a woman of color, so Black women specifically, 42K. Okay, yes, right? And these women are running million-dollar companies with investments of 42K. Now imagine if that same person had access to $1 million. Right? So these are some of the struggles that we're facing. The other thing is access to programs and networks. Before I got into a program in this city, oh my goodness, I didn't even get to a program in the city. I got into a program, actually, sorry, I take that back. I got into a program in the city. I shout out to Social Venture Zone, they're amazing. A program that was, how do I say this, has access to VCs. Right? So I got access, before you get access to a program, they're looking at your business. Is it tech-based? What problem are you solving? How are you using technology? If you're not using technology, you don't get in. Right? That's a barrier right there. So that's another thing. So access to programs, I wanted to talk about an experience I had, and I don't share this a lot, but I think it's important, especially for this room. So as we're designing, again, back to what she shared on the panel, as we're designing that, we're intentional about the people we're bringing on as mentors, right? If I don't see somebody who looks like me in the room, I'm not going to show up, because I'm going to assume it's not for me, right? And this is something that women entrepreneurs are going through, right? So I was in this program, and I had pitched my company, and the first question I got, everybody else got standard company questions about your company, blah, blah, blah. The first question I got was about fraud in Nigeria. I'm from Nigeria, right? So just to provide you perspective, because the person who was asking the question did not realize that that was not a question you're not supposed to ask, right? Because it had nothing to do with my company. So as we're designing, because then that becomes a fight of, I'm pushing back on, don't talk about fraud in Nigeria, as opposed to I'm pushing back on, oh, how do I get capital for my company, right? And this is my experience. Now, there's also a Fast Company article about Arlen Hamilton, who is a VC in the US, where she shares about another woman entrepreneur who was in a room with VCs, and the question the VC asked her was whether her dad was in her life. So I'm saying, again, I'm just going back to the points that were shared. The reason why we need to be intentional, the reason why we need to be, very much intentional in everything that we do and provide access, equal access to everybody, is because we're not just facing the fight of, oh, I can't get in the room with a VC. I'm also dealing with fraud in Nigeria. Okay, that's like, I didn't sign up for that, but okay, right? So just something to keep in mind.
I'm not entirely sure how to follow up from that. So I'm going to go back, Mary, to your very first opening comments. You talked about how women needed to have either a cosign or a man to approve their loan. And I mentioned, you had mentioned to us previous to this that you would be talking about that, and I mentioned it to one of my colleagues, and one of them sort of looked at me and said, oh yeah, and the other one, I'll say she was much younger than me, and she just sort of started stuttering. She said, I'm not comprehending what you're saying. And I, try not to smile, but that was my experience. I was in school, I went through engineering physics, so talk about not having people in front of you who know what you look like and recognize what you look like. I was one of the only girls in my class. And I remember my dad was away on a business trip, and my mom said, oh, your uncle's coming over because he needs to talk to the bank. And we said, what are you talking about? And she said, oh, they just need a man's voice on the phone. So I've got all of our details down. He's going to come over because I need to do something. Your dad's not here to approve it. And at the time, I was like, I'm not comprehending what you're saying. It took me a long time to even understand what she was talking about. And then once I finally did clue in, at the time, I couldn't understand why a chartered bank would have such a policy. And I was absolutely outraged on her behalf. Being a woman in engineering and a woman in tech, I couldn't, had my own battles to fight on a daily basis, and I couldn't believe that she was facing this. And so I mentioned that because it sort of sets the tone for where I wanted to bring in some of the gaps that I saw. And we've talked about the access to capital and access to funding, and absolutely. We also heard a really rich discussion earlier on access to networks and having role models. And one of the impacts of that is that it really limits a woman's ability to imagine what's possible. And so you then pile onto that the time constraints, and some of the women that I talk to when I'm out, I sort of jokingly say, I think I have one of the best jobs at the bank, because I get to go out and I get to speak with women entrepreneurs and find out what is it that you're doing and how can I be helpful. And the question is not what can the bank do for you, but how can I be helpful, whether it's connecting you to a network, connecting you to another business. Certainly, if there's something BDC does that's helpful, then that's great too. But what I hear is I work 70 hours, 80 hours a week, and I hear that regularly. It's exhausting because it's not just I work all day in my business, but then I come home and I run the household as well, and that's so common. And so family economics can certainly come into play. We heard also talking about unconscious bias as being a huge component of it. And one of the things that we're actually initiating this year at BDC is we've developed unconscious bias training, specifically around gender bias training that we're rolling out across all client-facing employees at BDC to make that accessible to them and available to them to do, because that's a huge part of it. And being able to, it goes back to the imagining who's in front of you, imagining what you see, and part of that bias continues to come into play. And so oftentimes people don't realize that they have the bias until it's really put in front of you and you name it and you call it out. And so that's one of the things that we're actually trying to within our own house, make sure that we're addressing. And where I want to go with this is a story that kind of sums this up for me. And one of the things BDC has is online application for financing. We had a woman entrepreneur who applied for financing. She applied for $100,000. And we gave her a call because her business plan didn't actually match what she was asking for. Her business plan just sounded so cool. She was teaching young girls how to program. So first off, we're like, okay, cool, awesome. And then second of all, it's like, how are you going to do everything that you've said you want to accomplish with $100,000? And so we said, let's let that aside. Tell us more about your vision. Tell us not about what you think you need. Tell us about what you want. Like, tell us more. Well, we started working with her, and she said at the time, well, I didn't think I would get more than 100,000. And it was really easy to go online. So already we've got sort of that ambition piece coming in, but also she didn't have to interact with anyone, because then she wouldn't have to deal with that all over again, right? What was it, 2006 you said? They sort of started changing policies. That's only 13 years ago. That's not that long ago. I may be old if that doesn't feel like that long, but it's not that long ago, right? We remember. And so we spent a couple months working with her, trying to really get to understand her vision and where she wanted. Well, she came away having borrowed from us over $1 million in working capital to be able to actually do what she wanted to do. And then came back again a little while later to borrow another $2 or $3 million to buy a building. And so when you really look at that story for us, that tells me so much. It tells me that all of these things are compounded. All of these factors that we talked about played into what she was going to do. And I thought it would be a good illustration because we talked about, sort of those words of things that intersect. All of these problems, they're layers that sit on top of each other, in my opinion. And so those are some of the gaps that I think we're really seeing. And so one of the things, we've heard today about what those needs are, certainly having that conversation. The other thing that I wanted to raise that goes along with that is the health component, because I think that really factors into a huge part of it. So this past year, BDC funded a study with CAMH, so the Canadian Association for Mental Health, to look at what is happening with entrepreneurs and their health. And a few things came out of it. One of the biggest ones is that the majority of entrepreneurs suffer from depression. It's about 66% or 2/3. And of those companies who are starting, so small business with a limited number of employees, companies who are undergoing massive growth tend to suffer more, and women entrepreneurs suffer more often from depression. And so that's a huge component that one of the outcomes of the study was that the business community needs to talk about that. There needs to be a place to have conversation about not just mental health, but mental health and bodily health as well. And so I wanted to make sure that that got raised in the discussion because it's one of the aspects I haven't heard yet.
Okay, so I think there's 4 myths that we need to break through in order for this gap to close. And the first one is that women run social enterprises. Okay, they do, but they run profit businesses as well. And when I experienced it at CDL, so Creative Destruction Lab, again, I'm sitting in the room, 40 mentors. This woman got up and presented her business, and they automatically thought it was a social enterprise. And again, I was like, I heard her making money, sorry. And so I signed up to be her mentor because I was very curious to learn more about her business, and I spent the entire year helping her again with language, just because she had purpose within her business, which of course is also an extremely strong female characteristic. You also want to run something with a purpose, doesn't mean it's not a profit-oriented business. And this venture fund that we've started, 9 women, read their resumes, they are all business, like strong, powerful business women. They tell the story that they want to run this fund. And again, first assumption on us was, oh, so you're running a fund for social company, social, enterprise. And we were all like, what? When did we say that? And so we're now trying to come out with really aggressive language because we're realizing what people are hearing, and it's this myth that veils what we're actually saying. The myth veils that the assumption is you're running a social enterprise, so convince me it's a business, whereas if it's a man, it seems to be the opposite. And what we want to do in our next presentation is actually put up our titles and bios without our names or pictures, letting people assume they're 9 men and see how they react, because we're all kind of like, really? Anyway, so it's a really fascinating thing. The second myth is that women need support to run a successful business. Now, actually, if you look at the stats on women-run businesses, so startups, female-owned startups generate about twice as much on investment dollar than men do. That's from the Boston Consulting Group. First Round Capital did a study that female-founded companies perform 63% better than male-founded companies. The Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation, women-led teams generate a 35% higher ROI than all male teams. And if you look at studies about buyers, so if you go to the end customer, on many of these, health tech, urban tech, all these company zones, the buyers are actually women. So when you kind of veil and myth out the performance of women, you are really doing a huge disservice. And so the fact that women would need support to get a loan signed doesn't actually coincide with the effectiveness of how they run businesses. So that's a second myth. They're damn good at running businesses. The third is this notion, in the investors, so the venture investors, they're not very many women are there. So 2% of angel investors in Canada are female. and the money from partners, much, much lower for women. There's a myth in there by the funds not to invite women. Women do not want to be at the table investing. And you kind of go, what? Why? Because we have money and we invest, so why wouldn't we invest in, again, well-run businesses and startups who are going to make money, but they're not invited in. So one of the things we want to do with a female-focused venture fund is to just start to close the gap, because we actually have to educate the women, again, on language of being a venture investor, so that they can sit at the table and be invited. And so there's just as much education to do on both sides of the table to ensure inclusion and ensure invitations in to be part of this. And again, if you don't have women investors, how are you going to fairly judge the companies and fairly evaluate the end buyer and the end potential? Because you've cut off half the population's involvement in the decision. So it's an interesting myth that a mandate of our venture fund is kind of on the side of it is a lot of education, because that's kind of a crazy one when you see yourself being veiled in it. And then the fourth myth is that biases are bad, because it's been mentioned sort of all along the panel that there are unconscious biases. And as I mentioned earlier, I've been building a team, and I'm about halfway through, and my team's primarily women. It was super easy to hire amazing women because they're just right there, right? And so I've just hired 5 more people, and 4 of them are men, because I am looking at my team going, I have to make sure my network sources out the men, because we in the same way that a man-run team finds men easier, people have biases. But the biases aren't necessarily a bad thing, and so what you said about if you don't see the person ahead of you, it's harder to forge your way. Like when you see yourself, you can plow through a challenge because you're like, I'm going to be that person, and I can see it. And it's all unconscious, it's all lovely, it's all human, so it's not a bad thing. So if we put and encourage and invite more women to all these sides of the table, more will come. So the notion that we should be, I guess my final story on that was I was doing the chief inclusion role, and I was reading some articles about bias, and was always kind of cranky about the male leaders and how they didn't, change and reach out and have diverse teams. And then I kind of did this aha, and I looked up and I went, oh my goodness, I have unconscious bias, and I have all these female teams. And so in a bigger company, it looked good because I was balancing out the other teams, but I was no different, right? So how do you acknowledge your own bias and make conscious effort to balance it, and make conscious effort to use it? And so in this case, where we're coming in with a Women Venture Fund, we're kind of consciously using it to say, this community needs to close a gap, so we're going to hopefully bring in an army of women around the table to start closing the gap. And my goal would be in 10 years, I'd love to say we're somehow an integrated multi-gender, multi-everything fund that, it looks quite natural. Anyways, that was my long answer, and I won't answer that long anymore.
Right, thanks, Shannon. We're going to do one more question. We might not have time. It'll be very short answers, because I want to also get questions from the floor. But we know the differences in terms of funding for diverse women, but how are diverse women receiving funding? And I also invite you to talk about what needs to be done. Like, what is the call to action? What should change? So you can fold that into your answer if you wish. So Danielle?
So I try to avoid calling women diverse women. Diversity is within the team, and diverse teams perform better, and that's been proven time and time again. So, an individual in of themselves is not diverse. It is within the team that's reflected, and I think that's really the value add for a funder when they're looking at these teams and what the value is over time that's going to be proven out so that we can change, because people don't want to change unless it's been proven. And so that's one thing that we're working on closely at DreamMaker Ventures. We are looking to fund companies that represent all of these different communities. And realistically, if you're saying specific yeah, we can dive into where people can go in the ecosystem, how you can map it. A lot of this is navigating and building out those relationships within the angel community. So I can speak to the 15 angel networks that I've tapped into through the Angel Investors Ontario network. I think I know over 200 VCs in Canada now. So, if you tap into one person, you tap into their entire network. So that's how people are getting funded. And the challenge is that they're not relating to the people who are the funders. So that's the tiered approach. And I would say on it, just a call to action for everyone in the room, it's very important to, we're all on a learning journey. And so educating yourselves, read an intersectional feminist approach by a woman of color or someone who's non-binary. I didn't meet any trans women in this community. Trans women are women too. And they, also don't like to be called women identified. They just like to be called women. And so I think those types of use of language is so critical. And I'm not saying I'm perfect or anyone is, but it's super important to get that language right to make those environments inclusive. We're working with an Indigenous leader, and they've said multiple times, if you're talking about rural, urban, and reserve, use that language, and that language will make people feel included. And so that's a journey that I've gone on too, and I really appreciate the people in my network who have taught me so much about that. So I want to thank them, and I will give it to Nuhil.
Thank you, Danielle. That's a really good point. And I'll use the term underrepresented over diverse, so underrepresented women in entrepreneurship. And I think I'll tie it back to Scale Without Borders. I think it's really important for specific groups of women entrepreneurs to see themselves in another person. Specifically, for example, in our event series for Scale Without Borders, the whole idea is to bring up on stage, for example, a Nigerian woman entrepreneur who came as an international student to tell her story and to share her success. And who knows, maybe there are other Nigerian young women. It's so important for them to be able to see that story. That in and of itself opens the doors for them, right? Same thing for, myself. I know a lot of Moroccan people reached out to me. I'm Moroccan, and they were so impressed by my organization. I didn't think it would be that impressive, but just the fact that I was Moroccan and I came here and I was able to found something was a huge deal for them, and it's very encouraging. So I think that is really important, being able to shed the spotlight on underrepresented groups of women so others can identify with it.
That's wonderful. These ladies are just incredible. I get to hang out with them and stuff. I wanted to highlight the importance of allies. So Danielle is very true to everything she just said. This woman she's also the reason why we're on this stage today. She's very intentional about how can we get more women of color in the room? How can we make this conversation balanced? And I think there is a need for more of us to actually do that work as well, seeing who's missing at the table. How can we include them, right? So in terms of how Black women are raising money, they are not. They're bootstrapping, right? I shared the stats, 42K. I also wanted to share a story. So I have a person in my network who was able to turn $200 in investment. So she had $200, and she turned it into almost $500,000 in 18 months, right? But she's not a tech entrepreneur. She's in the beauty industry, right? But very innovative, very much into marketing. Can her business use technology? Yes. I think right now she's actually looking into chatbots and a bunch of other things. But she would not necessarily get into a top program, for example, right? So these are some things to think about. I also wanted to share that, so let's stop assuming that underrepresented means underperforming. This is a big problem. I'm from Nigeria, born and raised, okay? So where I grew up, it was all Black people. So there was nothing about you're Black, therefore we assume something. It's just excellence. You have to get a master's, a PhD, and this and that and that. It's education central, right? And then I come here and I bring up Black people, and the look on people's faces, I'm just I just said Black people. What's wrong with you, right? And so this is a problem, right? So we have to be intentional in our choice of language as well. So inclusive language, right? Here we use a lot of underrepresented, racialized, all that stuff. I understand the place for that language. But Arlen Hamilton, so this is the VC in the US, she did something amazing. She changed the term to underestimated. Because when you think of me as underestimated, you're like, I'm missing out. How can I get in touch with that person, right? So language is a key part of that. I also mentioned go out of your own way, and women equals all women. I can't tell you the number of rooms I'm in where they're like, oh yeah, and women of color. And I'm like, well, so what do you mean? Like when you said women, you just meant white women? Because that's kind of confusing for me, right? So it's like, when you say women, it should be inclusive, right? It should be representative. If you put if you're gonna have a panel, you wanna make sure that you're showcasing to people, we want you in the room, right? I think that was everything I have. Oh yes, targeted programming. So I wanted to shout out DreamMaker because they just launched an amazing program with the DMZ, Black Innovation Fellowship. The reason why programs like that, as well as Fierce Founders, so Fierce Founders like Community Tech, the reason why programs like that are important is because when you say to people, this program is for you, guess what happens? They show up, they actually apply. They're like, oh my gosh, Black Innovation Fellowship, I'm gonna go apply now, right? And so sometimes it's important to call out those groups so that they know that it's for them. So one of the things we do with My African Corner, I mentioned we plan workshops and conferences and all of that stuff. We also have surveys, and then we also get feedback on social media. I had, my last event, we had a panel where it wasn't intentional. I mean, I always put women on, whatever, but we had a panel that happened to be all Black women. And oh my gosh, people just lost it on social media. They're like, hashtag Black Girl Magic, hashtag Black 5 Bus Black Women. Like, so people actually see these things and it really resonates with them, right? And I was just like, oh, okay, right? And then in our surveys as well, the thing that comes back to us is we want to see, because I've had mentors from different groups come and speak to my audience. Again, my audience is Black people, right? We also provide them access to networks with different groups, right? So we don't just do our events. We also partner with groups like Scale Without Borders. We also partner with groups like Move the Dial, Elevate Tech Fest, so they have access to different networks. But when we're planning our workshops and conferences, because we know our audience, we're like, we need to bring Black mentors, but we also need to bring people who are in the ecosystem who can actually plug them in to different things, like VCs, right? And so one of the things that came back is they said, we want to see mentors that look like us, right? And so again, back to the whole idea of being intentional, going out of your own way, and thinking of ways that you can also bring other people into the room with you.
One of the things I hear often is that women are risk averse. And I'll tell you, that phrase drives me nuts. When you consider all of the gaps that we talked about and all the factors, I consider women to be highly risk aware. And you asked sort of, how are they funding? And they're funding by bootstrapping, personal savings, credit card, family and friends. I get a lot of questions about how can I find money for grants. There's also recent reports showing that women are really successful in crowdfunding because our language is inclusive, because our language is very personal. We tend to be very authentic when we speak. And so because of that, women tend to be more successful because it's also blind, right? It's about the business idea. And so the two things that are takeaway for me is that we need to increase financial literacy and we need to increase procurement literacy. It looks like supplier diversity programs, and I know there was a fantastic panel on that earlier, and BDC has been was recently launched and has been really strongly advocating for more supplier diversity, or more diversity in our supply chain specifically. The other thing we do is we've been launching roundtable and boot camps to raise fund, not just literacy overall, but also just business acumen, which are important things. And I think the thing that I wanted to take away from that is I had the pleasure of hearing Manjit Minha speak last week. And one of the things that was her nugget, and I'm going to pass it on to the rest of you, was to do some training in negotiation skills. Because no matter what we're doing, whether it's small business or otherwise, at some point in time we're negotiating and trying to get the very best deal for what we can. And so whether it's with bootstrapping or whether it's with networking or whether, whatever the situation was, whether it's trying to get your kid to sleep in the right bed, you're still negotiating. And so that's my takeaway for you for today.
Here's an analogy to think about. In the business world, they've discovered that if they're screening resumes, they're highly biased. And so if they see universities or cities or names that they know and like, they tend to get unconsciously filtered in. In the venture capital world, I wonder if we couldn't anonymize a little more. It seems like it's still pretty face-to-face subjective. And so what if we led with data first and then allowed the biases to creep in later. So I sort of leave that as a thought. Are we not doing enough data screening in venture capital? Because the data actually shows it's a pretty successful group that are female, run businesses. Let's look at that before we understand and judge who they are. So that's a thought I'll leave.
Yeah, thank you, Shannon. Sort of like presenting those job descriptions before you actually see the face. This is what they're doing.